The small town of Ashwood had always been a place of whispers. Nestled deep in the shadow of towering pines, it was the kind of town that never saw much of the outside world. The locals liked it that way. Quiet, undisturbed, but not forgotten. Everyone knew the stories, though. Tales passed down around campfires or whispered late at night in hushed tones, when even the crickets seemed to fall silent. It was said that the woods came alive after dark, not with animals or the wind, but with something far older, something that fed on the stillness. Most dismissed the legends as nonsense, but there were always those who spoke with that peculiar tone of someone who knew better, and they would tell you about the lights. It was always the lights that started it. Tommy Grayson first saw them while driving home after a late shift at the diner. The forest pressed against the narrow road, a wall of impenetrable blackness. The beam of his headlights sliced through the dark, but it wasn't enough to shake the unease that had crept up his spine. Then, just as he rounded the last bend before home, he saw it, a faint, pulsing glow in the distance, hovering between the trees. He slammed the brakes, his old truck screeching to a stop. At first, he thought it might have been the reflection of his lights, but the longer he stared, the more he realized it was moving. Swirling in rhythmic patterns, it drew him in like the pull of a tide. Without even thinking, Tommy left the truck idling and stepped out onto the road. The woods were silent, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the lights. Tommy took a hesitant step forward, then another, the gravel crunching underfoot. His breath fogged in the chill night air as he reached the edge of the forest. The lights seemed closer now, bobbing and weaving just out of reach. They beckoned him, whispered his name. Tommy? He froze. It wasn't possible. The voice wasn't his imagination. It was real, low and sweet, like the kind you'd hear in a dream. His heart hammered in his chest, a warning he ignored as he took another step into the trees. The air changed as he entered the forest. It was heavier, colder, and every breath felt like inhaling water. The lights grew brighter, illuminating a narrow path that didn't exist moments ago. Against all reason, Tommy followed. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to warp as he walked deeper into the woods. The lights darted ahead, always staying just out of reach. The voice grew louder, more insistent, calling his name with a coaxing lilt. Then abruptly, the lights stopped. They hovered above a clearing, bathing the area in an eerie glow. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling well. Its stones were slick with moss, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse like a living thing. The lights swirled around it, faster and faster, until they vanished, plunging the clearing into darkness. Tommy hesitated, staring at the well, his breath coming in short gasps. Tommy. The voice was behind him now, close enough to feel its icy breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Panic set in, and he stumbled back, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, the wind knocked from his lungs as he stared up at the black sky. The stars seemed wrong, twisted and alien. A sound came from the well, wet, slithering, like something clawing its way up from the depths. Tommy scrambled to his feet, but his body refused to move fast enough. The voice was louder now, echoing all around him, a chorus of whispers that merged into an unbearable crescendo. And then he saw it. A hand, impossibly long and pale, emerged from the well. It gripped the edge, followed by another and another. The thing pulled itself free, its body an unnatural tangle of limbs and shapes that hurt to look at. Its face, or what might have been a face, was a blank expanse of skin with no eyes or mouth. But it didn't need them. Tommy could feel it staring at him, boring into his mind. He turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. The whispers followed, growing louder, closer. He didn't stop until he reached the road, his truck still idling where he left it. He threw himself inside, slamming the door and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled with the gear shift, but as he looked up, he froze. The thing was standing in the middle of the road, its shape illuminated by his headlights. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the air with a crushing weight. Tommy floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward. For a moment, he thought he'd hit it, but when the truck passed through the spot, there was nothing there. He didn't look back. The next morning, the townsfolk found his truck abandoned on the side of the road. The door was wide open, and there was no sign of Tommy. Search parties combed the woods for days, but no trace of him was ever found. The stories of the lights grew louder after that, spreading beyond Ashwood to neighboring towns. But no one dared to investigate. Not anymore. The woods held their secrets tightly, and those who pried too far were never seen again. Yet, late at night, if you stand on the edge of the forest and listen closely, you might hear it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, a voice calling out a name. The storm rolled in faster than anyone had expected. The sky over Black Hollow swallowed the sun, turning the late afternoon into an unnatural twilight. Mary Crenshaw, the last clerk at the old general store that evening, locked up and started her walk home. Her boots crunched against the gravel road, the town unusually silent under the oppressive weight of the gathering storm. Halfway home, she spotted something strange. Parked on the side of the road, near the edge of the woods, was a car. Its doors were open, its headlights dimming, and steam hissed from under the hood. A man stood nearby, his back to her, staring into the forest. He was still, too still. Mary hesitated. Something about him made her gut tighten. "Hey, you okay?" she called out, forcing her voice to sound steadier than she felt. The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Mary glanced back toward the town. She was already too far to run back easily, but the thought of walking past him alone chilled her. The first drops of rain began to fall, spattering the dusty road. "Sir, do you need help?" She tried again, taking a cautious step forward. He turned suddenly, his movements jerky, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. The face that met hers was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Just a low, gurgling sound, like water bubbling up from a clogged drain. "Sir?" Mary's voice quivered. The man raised an arm and pointed toward the woods. His hand trembled violently, his finger locking onto something between the trees. Mary squinted, trying to follow his gaze, but all she saw was darkness. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a shadow, a tall, thin shape, almost human, but not quite. It seemed to shimmer as though the rain wasn't touching it. Its head cocked to one side, and Mary felt it. A weight pressing on her chest, cold and suffocating. Her instincts screamed at her to run. The man collapsed to his knees, gasping, clawing at his throat. Mary froze as the shadow thing began to move, its body shifting unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles. It stepped closer to the man, each movement slow and deliberate. When it reached him, its hand, if you could call it that, stretched toward his face. "Run," the man choked out, his voice hoarse and desperate. Mary didn't need to be told twice. She spun on her heel and sprinted down the road, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind her, the man's screams filled the air, sharp and agonized, cutting through the storm like a blade. She didn't dare look back. By the time she reached her house, her clothes were soaked through, her skin cold to the bone. She fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling, before finally shoving the door open and slamming it shut behind her. She locked it, bolted it, then dragged a heavy chair in front for good measure. The rain hammered against the windows, the storm now in full fury. Mary backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her ears. Her phone was in her pocket, but her hands shook too much to call for help. She sank to the floor, trying to catch her breath, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The rain wasn't just hitting the windows, it was streaking down inside. Her eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where the faint glow of her bedside lamp flickered. The light was dim, struggling against the deepening shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. She could feel it again, the suffocating weight from the road. Mary forced herself to stand. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It's just the storm." But the shadow moved. It peeled itself from the corner, rising, stretching until it nearly touched the ceiling. It had no eyes, no face, but it was looking at her. She could feel it, boring into her mind, her very soul. The room grew colder, her breath fogging in the air. Mary stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the rug, sending her crashing to the floor. The shadow crept closer, soundless, a predator stalking its prey. "Please," she whimpered. "Please don't." The shadow paused, its form rippling. For a moment, Mary thought it might leave, but then it reached for her. The last thing Mary saw was the darkness swallowing her, filling her lungs, her screams drowned out by the storm. The next morning, the storm had passed. A soft sun rose over Black Hollow, and the townsfolk emerged to assess the damage. The sheriff found Mary's front door wide open. The house was silent, undisturbed except for the damp footprints leading from the door to her empty bedroom. On the road outside of town, the abandoned car still sat, its doors closed now, the engine cold. The man who owned it was never found, though his wallet and phone were still inside, and in the woods where the rain never seemed to reach, the shadows lingered. The small house on Birch Lane had stood vacant for years, its shutters hanging loose, its windows clouded with grime. The kids in town said it was haunted, though no one could say why. Some claimed to see flickering lights in the upstairs windows at night, while others swore they heard faint cries echoing from within. Emma didn't believe in ghost stories, at least not until the night she moved in. The rent was dirt cheap, too good to pass up for a college student scraping by. The landlord had shrugged off her questions about the house's history, muttering something about superstition before handing her the keys. By the time she arrived with her boxes, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked driveway. The inside was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Emma's skin crawl. The air smelled stale, like something left to rot. She chalked it up to years of disuse and set to work unpacking, ignoring the way the floorboards creaked under her every step. It wasn't until later, when she was lying in bed, that she noticed the first sign something was wrong. A faint scratching sound echoed from the ceiling. She froze, listening, her breath caught in her throat. Mice, she thought, just mice. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and tried to ignore it. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, as though whatever was up there was trying to get her attention. Emma sat up, her heart racing. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was her pounding heartbeat. Then, slowly, a new noise began. A soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, moving across the ceiling toward the stairs. Emma's blood ran cold. Mice didn't make footsteps. Gripping her phone like a lifeline, she climbed out of bed and crept toward the bedroom door. The house was dark, the moonlight barely enough to illuminate the hallway. She could hear the footsteps now, descending the stairs, slow and deliberate. She considered calling the police, but the thought of speaking out loud, of making any sound at all, terrified her. She tiptoed to the top of the stairs, peering down into the blackness below. "Who's there?" she whispered. A sudden bang made her jump, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. She scrambled to pick it up, her breath coming in short gasps. When she looked back down the stairs, her heart nearly stopped. Something was at the bottom. It stood just beyond the reach of the moonlight, its shape human but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Emma couldn't see its face, but she could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. "Get out!" she screamed, backing away. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, slowly, it began to climb the stairs. Its movements were jerky, each step accompanied by the sound of creaking wood and something wet, like meat slapping against the floor. Emma bolted for her room, slamming the door and locking it. She pressed her back against it, her chest heaving as tears streamed down her face. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Then they stopped. The silence was unbearable. Emma strained to hear, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned white. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. She couldn't tell. Just when she thought it might be safe, the whispering began. It was soft at first, like wind through the trees, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room. Words she couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that was both too close and impossibly far away. And then the doorknob began to turn. Emma screamed, throwing her weight against the door as it rattled on its hinges. The whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to dial 911, but when she glanced back at the door, she saw it. The thing wasn't outside anymore, it was inside the room. Its face was a blank expanse of flesh, smooth and featureless. She could feel its eyes on her. It crouched in the corner, its limbs folded awkwardly, like a spider waiting to pounce. Emma dropped her phone, her scream caught in her throat as the thing began to crawl toward her. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was its mouth, stretching open impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. The next day, the landlord arrived to collect the rent. He knocked on the door, then frowned when it swung open. Inside, the house was empty. All that was left was Emma's phone, lying in the middle of the room. The screen was cracked, the last call never sent, but the camera app was open, and on the screen was a single photo. It showed Emma, wide-eyed and terrified, standing in her bedroom, and behind her grinning was the thing. The Old Mill Road was a shortcut nobody used, especially after dark. It wasn't just because the road was uneven and choked with weeds. It was the stories, the ones that made even the bravest shiver. Whispers of shadows that followed you home, voices that called your name from the ditch, and worst of all, the girl in the white dress. Danny had heard it all before, but a storm was rolling in, and he didn't want to waste time taking the longer route back to town. The first fat drops of rain spattered his windshield as he turned onto the narrow dirt road, muttering under his breath. The headlights of his car illuminated the overgrown path, branches clawing at the sides like skeletal hands. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain picked up, pinging against the hood. Danny gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. It wasn't long before he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a pale figure at the edge of the road, barely visible through the rain. But as his car drew closer, his stomach twisted. She was there, standing barefoot in the mud, her dress soaked and clinging to her thin frame. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, hiding her eyes. Danny slowed the car, his pulse racing. Every nerve screamed at him to keep going, but he couldn't stop himself. He rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, you okay? Need a ride?" The girl didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Danny hesitated, the rain now pouring so hard it blurred his vision. He leaned out a little further, raising his voice. "Miss, do you?" Her head snapped up. Danny's words died in his throat. Her face was wrong. The skin was too pale, stretched too tight across her bones. Her mouth hung open, too wide, and her eyes, black as a starless night, locked onto his. A smile spread across her face, slow and unnatural. Danny's foot slammed on the gas before he even realized he'd shifted into gear. The car lurched forward, tires spinning in the muck. He didn't look back, couldn't look back, but he felt it, her gaze burning into the back of his head, her laughter rising above the roar of the storm. He didn't stop until he reached town, his chest heaving, his hands trembling on the wheel. The rain had stopped, but Danny's relief was short-lived. The passenger seat was soaked. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. He told himself it was just his imagination, that the rain had played tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. Around midnight, he heard it, a faint tapping at the window. Danny sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light a sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The tapping came again, louder this time, insistent. He forced himself to get up, his legs unsteady beneath him. Slowly, he approached the window, every step a battle against the icy dread creeping up his spine. The curtains shifted in the breeze. And then he saw her. She was standing on the other side of the glass, her face inches from his. That same smile, wide and unnatural, stretched across her pale skin. Her black eyes stared into his, unblinking. Danny stumbled back, his scream caught in his throat. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as though she was pounding on the glass with both hands. He tripped over a chair, landing hard on the floor. When he looked up again, the window was empty. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the hallway, came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Danny scrambled to his feet, grabbing the closest thing to a weapon, a baseball bat he kept by the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside his bedroom. The doorknob turned. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. At first, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, she stepped into the room, her white dress now stained with mud and rainwater. Her smile was gone, replaced by something far worse, a look of hunger. Danny swung the bat, but it passed through her like smoke. She tilted her head, that awful smile returning as she raised a single skeletal finger and pointed at him. "No," Danny whispered, backing away. "No, this isn't real." She stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she didn't quite know how to use her body. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. Danny tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. Her voice was a whisper, but it filled the room, echoing in his head. "You asked if I needed a ride." Danny's screams were never heard. The next morning, the police found his car abandoned on the Old Mill Road, the door open and the engines still running. No one ever saw Danny again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, drivers on that road claim to see a figure standing by the edge. And if you're unlucky enough to stop, you might find yourself giving her a ride too. It was nearly midnight when Clara turned onto Hollow Creek Road, the shortcut that cut through the woods. Her stomach churned with unease, but the main highway was closed, and she had no choice. The road was narrow and winding, swallowed by trees on either side. Her headlights barely pierced the suffocating darkness. The radio crackled, cutting in and out as static hissed. Clara reached over, fiddling with the dial, trying to find a station. As she did, she caught something out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing on the side of the road. Clara's foot instinctively eased off the gas. The figure was a man, wearing an old-fashioned coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with his head bowed. As her car passed, her breath caught in her throat. He didn't have a face. The man's head was smooth and featureless, as if someone had erased it with a single swipe. Clara's grip on the wheel tightened, and she pressed the gas pedal, her car surging forward. She told herself she was imagining things, that it had to be a trick of the shadows. But then the radio came back. A low, distorted voice broke through the static, whispering her name. Clara. Her chest tightened. She turned the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. It was still there, coming from the speakers, growing louder. Her name, over and over, whispered in a dozen different voices. Clara, Clara. She slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The voice fell silent, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. She sat frozen, her hands trembling on the wheel. Then, slowly, she looked in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road behind her. She couldn't see his face. There was nothing to see, but she knew he was watching her. Clara's heart pounded as she threw the car into gear and sped off, the tires kicking up gravel. The road ahead twisted and turned, her headlights bouncing off the trunks of towering trees. She didn't dare look back again. The road seemed endless, stretching on and on. Panic gnawed at her as the minutes dragged by. She should have reached the town by now, but there was no sign of it, no lights, no buildings, nothing but the oppressive darkness of the woods. And then she saw him again. He was standing in the road ahead, exactly as he had before, motionless, his head bowed. Clara screamed and swerved, her car narrowly missing him as it veered off the pavement and into a ditch. The impact jolted her forward, her seatbelt digging into her chest. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in silence. Clara fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. The call wouldn't connect. The screen flickered, then went dark. She threw it onto the passenger seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the woods were deathly quiet. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the suffocating weight of silence. Then, softly, came the sound of footsteps. Clara's head snapped toward the window. The man was there, standing just outside, his faceless head inches from the glass. His hand, long and pale, reached up and pressed against the window. "Leave me alone," Clara screamed, scrambling to lock the doors. The man didn't move. He simply stood there, his blank face staring at her. Then, without warning, he disappeared. Not stepped away, not faded, just gone. Clara's breathing hitched. She glanced around, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The car felt like a cage, too small, too vulnerable. She had to get out of there. She turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally roared to life. Clara floored the gas, the tires spinning before the car lurched out of the ditch and back onto the road. She drove faster than she ever had, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The road ahead was straight now, no more twists or turns. Relief began to bubble in her chest. Maybe she was finally free. And then the headlights flickered. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The lights went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The car began to slow, the engine whining before it sputtered and died. Clara slammed the wheel, her sobs breaking the silence. She fumbled for her phone again, but it wouldn't turn on. A soft tapping sound broke the stillness. Clara froze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, coming from the roof of the car. She didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but something inside her demanded she know. Slowly, she rolled down the window and leaned out, her heart pounding in her ears. The tapping stopped. She looked up. The man was crouched on the roof, his head tilted toward her, his featureless face somehow filled with malice. His hand shot down, gripping her wrist with an icy, vice-like grip. Clara screamed, jerking back, but his strength was inhuman. The last thing she saw was his other hand reaching for her, impossibly long fingers wrapping around her throat. The next day, a state trooper found Clara's car abandoned on Hollow Creek Road. The engine was dead, and the interior was soaked with rainwater. Clara was never found. But locals say if you drive Hollow Creek Road late at night, you might catch a glimpse of her in your rearview mirror. And if you see the man, it's already too late. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. Jason had been driving for hours, the stretch of highway, an endless ribbon of asphalt beneath a starless sky. The occasional glow of his headlights revealed nothing but barren fields on either side. He hadn't seen another car for miles. The fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank. Jason cursed under his breath. He'd planned to reach the next town by now, but his GPS had stopped working hours ago, leaving him guessing his way forward. That's when he saw the sign. It was old, the paint peeling and barely legible. Harmony Falls, 2 miles. A feeling of unease prickled at the back of his neck, but the thought of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere was worse. He turned off the highway and onto a dirt road, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground. The road twisted through dense woods, the trees gnarled and ancient. Jason's grip tightened on the wheel as the fog grew thicker, swallowing the light. He rolled down the window slightly, hoping to see better. The air smelled damp, like decaying leaves and stagnant water. Then he heard it, a soft, distant humming. It was faint, almost melodic, like someone singing a lullaby far off in the trees. Jason frowned, leaning closer to the open window. The humming grew louder, closer, though he still couldn't see anything but the oppressive fog. "Hello?" He called out, his voice breaking the eerie quiet. The humming stopped. Jason slammed the window shut and pressed the accelerator, the car bouncing over the uneven road. He couldn't explain it, but something about that sound had unsettled him. It wasn't just that it had stopped so suddenly, it was the way it had felt, as though it wasn't meant to be heard. Ahead, faint lights glimmered through the trees. Relief washed over him. The town. Finally. The road ended abruptly, spilling into a small clearing. Harmony Falls wasn't much of a town. A few crumbling buildings lined a single street, their windows dark and lifeless. The faint glow he'd seen came from an old gas station on the far end of the street, its flickering neon sign buzzing in the silence. Jason pulled up to the pump and got out. The air was colder here, the fog clinging to his skin like a damp sheet. He glanced around, hoping to find an attendant, but the place seemed deserted. "Hello," he called out again, his voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Jason swiped his card at the pump and began to fill his tank. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The town was too quiet, too still, like the air was holding its breath. A faint movement caught his eye. Across the street, in the window of what looked like an old general store, a figure stood watching him. Jason froze. The figure didn't move, didn't step closer, just stood there, its face obscured by shadow. "Can I help you?" Jason called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure remained still. Jason's pulse quickened. The pump clicked, signaling a full tank, and he replaced the nozzle, moving quickly back to the driver's seat. He glanced back toward the window, and the figure was gone. He didn't wait. Slamming the door shut, he started the engine and pulled onto the street. The tires crunched over gravel as he sped through the fog, desperate to leave Harmony Falls behind. But the road didn't lead back to the highway. Instead, it looped back into the town. Jason's heart sank as he found himself driving past the same gas station, the same darkened buildings. The neon sign flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the pavement. "No," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "This isn't right." He tried again, taking a different turn, but the road led him back once more. The gas station loomed ahead, its buzzing sign a mocking beacon in the fog. Jason parked the car in frustration, his breath fogging up the windshield. He got out, determined to find someone, anyone, to help him. The air was heavy with silence as he stepped onto the cracked pavement, and then he heard it again. The humming. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding him. Jason's skin crawled as the melody grew louder, filling the air with its strange, haunting tune. He spun around, searching for the source, but the fog had thickened, swallowing the street and buildings whole. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The humming stopped, and then a whisper, close to his ear, "You don't leave." Jason turned sharply, but no one was there. His chest heaved, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. He stumbled back to his car, fumbling for the keys. The humming returned, louder now, relentless. Jason's hands shook as he started the engine. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing the road ahead. or what should have been the road. Instead, figures stood in the beams of light. Dozens of them. Their faces were featureless, smooth like porcelain, and their heads tilted in unison as they watched him. Jason screamed, slamming the car into reverse. The tires screeched as he backed up, but the figures were behind him too, closing in from all sides. The humming rose to a deafening crescendo, drilling into his skull. The last thing Jason saw was a hand, pale, thin, and impossibly long, reaching for his windshield, as the fog swallowed him whole. Weeks later, a passing motorist reported an abandoned car on the edge of Harmony Falls. The engine was cold, the doors unlocked, there was no sign of Jason. But on foggy nights, travelers sometimes hear a faint humming on the road near the town, and those who stop to listen never leave. The clock in Hannah's living room struck midnight, its chime echoing through the empty house. She sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her, the glow of the TV flickering across the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. It was the kind of night that made the world feel small and isolated. She hadn't planned on being home alone, but her roommate, Lily, had decided last minute to spend the weekend at her boyfriend's place. "You'll be fine," Lily had said. "Just lock the doors and don't watch too many scary movies." Hannah regretted ignoring that advice. The movie she'd picked, a slasher film about a haunted house, had put her on edge. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt ominous. She turned off the TV, deciding she'd had enough, and checked her phone. 12:03. Too late to call anyone, and the texts from Lily were all hours old. A loud thump came from upstairs. Hannah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She stared at the ceiling, listening. The sound didn't come again. It was probably just the wind, she told herself. Or maybe a loose shutter. She swallowed her fear and forced herself to relax. Another thump, this one louder. She grabbed her phone and stood, her legs trembling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The house answered with silence. Slowly, she moved toward the stairs, gripping the banister tightly. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she climbed, each sound making her wince. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall. She peered into Lily's room first. Empty, as expected. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn shut. Hannah closed the door softly and moved to her own room. It looked normal, her bed unmade, clothes strewn across a chair, nothing out of place. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. Her closet door was ajar. Hannah's breath hitched. She always closed it before going to bed. Always. The crack was narrow, just enough to see the darkness inside. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and pulled it open. The closet was empty. She let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over her. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, shutting the door firmly. She headed back downstairs, determined to shake off the unease. A cup of tea, she decided. That would calm her nerves. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The rhythmic tick of the burner lighting was oddly comforting. She turned to grab a mug from the cabinet and froze. The closet door was open again. Her mind raced. She just closed it. She knew she had. Her hands shook as she dialed Lily's number, pressing the phone to her ear. The call rang and rang, then went to voicemail. "Lily, it's me. I think someone's in the house." Her voice broke on the last word. "Call me back, please." She hung up and grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a heavy frying pan. Her heart pounded as she crept back upstairs, each step feeling like a death march. When she reached her room, the closet door stood wide open, revealing nothing but shadows. "Come out," she demanded, her voice shaking. "I know you're in there." No response. She stepped closer, the pan raised. Her free hand reached for the light switch inside the closet, flicking it on. The space was illuminated, every corner visible. Empty. She laughed again, this time more out of hysteria than relief. "Losing it," she muttered, shaking her head. Completely losing it. She closed the door one more time and wedged a chair under the handle. Feeling slightly more secure, she returned to the kitchen. The kettle was boiling, steam hissing from the spout. She poured the water into her mug, her hands steadying now. The sound of the wind outside seemed less menacing, the house quieter. Maybe she'd imagined everything. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from directly behind her. Hannah turned slowly, her stomach dropping. The closet door wasn't just open, it was gone. The frame was there, but beyond it was an expanse of darkness, an impossible void that seemed to stretch forever. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, echoing from deep within. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, dark, empty sockets, seemed to look right through her. Hannah stumbled back, the mug shattering on the floor. She raised the frying pan, but her arms felt weak, as if the very presence of the thing was draining her strength. The figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Its mouth opened, a wide, gaping void, and from it came a low, guttural whisper. "Leave." Hannah couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her body felt frozen, trapped under the weight of its gaze. The figure stepped closer, reaching for her with long, bony fingers, and then everything went dark. When Lily returned 2 days later, the house was silent. The door was unlocked, and Hannah's car was still in the driveway. Inside, everything seemed normal, except for the faint smell of burnt tea. Lily called for Hannah, but there was no answer. She checked every room, her unease growing with each empty space. Finally, she opened the closet in Hannah's room. The closet was empty, but scratched into the wood of the back wall, deep and jagged, were the words, "Leave while you can." Lily didn't stay long enough to unpack. She left the house that night and never came back. No one else did either. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the sky seemed to weep endlessly, and the streets glistened with the reflection of flickering streetlights. Mia had just finished her late shift at the diner and was walking home. She hated taking the alley shortcut, but the thought of getting out of the cold rain as quickly as possible was too tempting to resist. The alley was narrow and long, with brick walls on either side, slick with rainwater. Puddles pooled along the cracked pavement, and the only sound was the steady patter of rain on her umbrella. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, her breath misting in the chill air. Halfway through, she noticed something odd, a faint tapping noise. Not the rain, but something sharper, more deliberate. She stopped, her heart quickening. The sound stopped, too. She turned, scanning the alley. Nothing but shadows. The dim streetlight at the far end barely illuminated the space, leaving most of it cloaked in darkness. Mia shook her head and kept walking, quickening her pace. The tapping resumed. It was louder now, echoing off the brick walls, and it seemed to be following her. Mia spun around, her umbrella trembling in her grip. "Hello?" she called out, her voice unsteady. The alley answered with silence. Her stomach twisted with unease as she turned back and hurried toward the light at the end of the alley. Her boots splashed through puddles, the sound mingling with the persistent tapping that never seemed to fade. It was closer now, too close. She reached the end of the alley and darted into the open street. The rain felt heavier here, almost suffocating. She turned back, expecting to see someone or something emerge from the shadows. But the alley was empty, eerily still. Breathing a sigh of relief, Mia continued down the street. Her apartment building was just a few blocks away. She could already see the faint glow of its porch light in the distance. The rain fell harder, and her umbrella struggled against the wind. She had almost convinced herself that she'd imagined the whole thing when she heard it again. The tapping. But this time wasn't coming from behind her. It was ahead. Mia froze. Her umbrella dipped slightly, the rain soaking her hair as her eyes darted toward the sound. There, under the streetlight near her building, stood a figure. It was hunched, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. One arm dangled limply by its side, while the other tapped a long, pointed object. A stick? A cane against the wet pavement. Tap! 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 Mia's breath hitched. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and awkward, like a marionette controlled by unskilled hands. The light from the street lamp flickered, casting it briefly in shadow. When the light steadied, the figure was closer. Too close. Its face came into view, and Mia felt her knees weaken. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched too tight over its skull. Its eyes were sunken, black pits. And its mouth, if you could call it that, was a jagged slit that curled unnaturally at the edges. It raised the stick, tapping it against the pavement again. The sound sharp and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Mia took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if the very presence of the figure was rooting her to the spot. The figure tilted its head further, the jagged slit of its mouth widening into something resembling a grin. And then, in a voice that was low and gravelly, it whispered, "Why did you come this way?" Mia's paralysis broke. She turned and ran, her umbrella dropping to the ground behind her. Her footsteps splashed through puddles as she raced down the street, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare look back. The tapping followed. It was relentless, matching her pace no matter how fast she ran. Tap, tap. It grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to her. The rain blurred her vision and her lungs burned as she reached her apartment building. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers slippery and shaking. Behind her, the tapping stopped. She dared a glance over her shoulder. The street was empty. The figure was gone. Mia rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The sound of the rain outside seemed distant now, muffled by the thick walls of the building. She made her way to her apartment, checking over her shoulder every few seconds. The hallway was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming softly. Once inside, she bolted the door and slid the chain into place. The familiar surroundings of her small living room brought a wave of comfort. But then she saw it. On the floor by the window was a single, wet footprint. Mia's blood ran cold. She hadn't taken off her shoes yet, and she hadn't gone near the window. Slowly, she backed away, her eyes locked on the footprint. Her hand reached for her phone on the coffee table. A soft tapping sound came from the bedroom. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the hallway, the phone slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, coming from behind the closed bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. Her vision blurred with tears as she crept toward the door, each step feeling like a lifetime. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening. The tapping stopped. Then, in that same gravelly voice, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come this way." The door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkness within. Mia didn't have time to scream. The next morning, the landlord found Mia's apartment empty. Her door was still locked from the inside, and her umbrella lay abandoned in the alley. But on rainy nights, some say you can hear the tapping in that alley, a slow, deliberate sound that follows you wherever you go. The storm rolled in suddenly, thunder cracking like a whip as rain lashed against the windows of the old countryside inn. Sarah had checked in late, the only guest that night, according to the innkeeper. He was an older man, frail and hunched, with eyes that seemed too wary for someone running a cozy bed and breakfast. "You'll be in room 6, he had said, sliding an old brass key across the desk. His voice was steady, but there was something in his tone, a hint of unease. As she climbed the creaky staircase to her room, Sarah chalked it up to her imagination. It had been a long drive, and the howling wind outside wasn't helping her nerves. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was quaint, with antique furniture and floral wallpaper. A large mirror hung above the dresser, and the bed looked inviting, if a little lumpy. Sarah unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. She glanced at the mirror as she moved about, catching fleeting glimpses of herself. Something about the way the glass reflected the room felt off. The angles were wrong, or maybe the shadows were deeper than they should have been. She turned away, dismissing it as a trick of the poor lighting. By the time she'd changed into her pajamas, the storm was in full force. Thunder rumbled and the wind shrieked like a living thing. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers tight around her. The bedside lamp cast a warm glow, and she considered leaving it on. She wasn't afraid of the dark, but the storm made her uneasy. She turned off the light anyway. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flicker of lightning. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on the steady rhythm of the rain. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxing as sleep began to take hold. Then she heard it, a soft creak like the groan of old wood. It came from the dresser. Sarah opened her eyes, her heart pounding. The room was silent now, the storm muted, as though the world were holding its breath. She sat up, squinting into the darkness. The mirror above the dresser gleamed faintly, catching the light of another lightning flash. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, something shifting in the reflection. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Sarah reached for her phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dresser and the mirror. Everything looked normal. She let out a shaky laugh, embarrassed at her own paranoia, and set the phone back down. Another creak. This time it came from the foot of her bed. Sarah froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her eyes forward to ignore whatever was there, but the compulsion to look was stronger. Slowly, she turned her head. There was nothing there, just the darkness and the faint outline of the bedpost. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's just the storm," she whispered to herself. But when she glanced at the mirror again, her blood ran cold. Her reflection wasn't lying down anymore. The figure in the mirror stood beside the bed, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. It wasn't her. The face was wrong, distorted, pale, and smiling with too many teeth. Sarah scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered and died. She grabbed her phone, the flashlight beam trembling as she aimed it at the mirror. The reflection was gone. Panic surged through her as she backed toward the door. The room was suffocatingly silent now, the storm outside a distant memory. She reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the sound of soft breathing filled the room. It was coming from behind her. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned her head. The figure was there, inches away. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, and its voice was a whisper, dry and brittle like dead leaves. "You shouldn't have looked," Sarah screamed, flinging the door open and bolting into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she reached the lobby, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The innkeeper looked up from his desk, his face grave. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked softly. What was that?" Sarah stammered. "What is in that room?" The innkeeper shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. "I told them to stop renting that room. The mirror, it's been there longer than the inn. No one knows where it came from, but it shows things that aren't supposed to be seen." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her car keys and fled into the stormy night, vowing never to return. Months later, the inn shut down, its windows boarded up and its doors locked. The locals whispered about strange happenings, about guests who vanished without a trace. But sometimes, late at night, people swear they see a faint glow in one of the windows. And if you stand close enough, you might catch a glimpse of your reflection in the glass, watching you with a smile that isn't your own.